Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Heifer International live chat. Today, I have with me a close friend, Daron Joffe, known as Farmer D, who's an expert, author, and educator in biodynamic farming. And we'll hear all about that from Farmer D. He's the author of a really interesting book, Citizen Farmer, The Biodynamic Way to Grow Healthy Food, Build Thriving Communities, and Give Back to the Earth. So we're going to talk about food, we're going to talk about farming, we're going to talk about communities, we talk how all this links together, kind of holistic view about how farming can build communities and make us, make a more peaceful, thriving world. So, Farmer D, thank you for joining me today. And why don't we start with one of your favorite subjects is, what is biodynamic farming? Some of us may know about it, but I think there's some slightly mystical aspects to it. And let's get clarity on that first.
Start with an easy one, huh? Give me a nice lob there, Pierre. Thank you for having me on. I tried to tackle this in the book. I include in the introduction, it's on page 14, a biodynamic primer. And there's a 30-second version and then like a 3-minute version in the book. And, I'll share the 30-second version, which is basically that, biodynamic farming is a closed loop regenerative farming model, a methodology that really treats the farm as a self-contained living organism, right? So biodynamic farmers use a range of holistic, spiritually rooted practices to grow highly nutritious food while caring deeply about the soil, the ecology, and the health and social well-being of both animals and people. And, biodynamic is organic. Organic is not necessarily biodynamic, but biodynamic follows all the principles of organic. No synthetic inputs, no chemical fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, GMOs. It goes beyond organic and is more aligned with what we call now more regenerative farming, where the standards are more about not bringing in inputs from the outside. A biodynamic farm really strives to create a balance where you're producing the food for animals. A lot of farms import their feed for animals. So the idea with a biodynamic farm is you actually grow in balance the amount of animals that you need to support the fertility of the land. And you grow the food for the animals, feed the animals poop, you compost the manures with your plant materials, you recycle that on the farm. And that virtuous cycle is a regenerative cycle that supports the biodynamic farm. The one other element, and we can get into it maybe a little bit later, is some of the more esoteric kind of following the moon planting, the biodynamic preparations, as they're called, which are essentially homeopathic medicine for the earth, for the soil, for the atmosphere, and for plants.
Yeah. So, I certainly have heard about this, about the ratio of animal to land and et cetera, et cetera. Do you actually have done calculations? Have got at least rule of thumb estimates between the two? Because, we at Heifer would like to be able to do this. And you call it biodynamic or regenerative farming. We could go to farmers and say, listen, you've got 3 acres of land in Malawi somewhere. I said, we really need to place 2 cows or 5 cows, whatever the right number is. So I think that's important in terms of training, right? I mean, you have it all. Well, anyway, you've got. I don't want to answer my own question.
Yeah, I mean, it's complex, right? Because there's every piece of land, every microclimate, resources are different, soils are different. But generally speaking, there's a bit of an intuitive relationship of how much a land can support with animal husbandry, how much feed can it provide to support animals without having to import food. Now, it gets more interesting when you start to think not just as the farm as a siloed property, but part of a farm community, right? So now you can start to look at collaboration and break some of the barriers of land availability by creating more of a community, a cooperative. But essentially, you need enough land to support animals without overly, impacting and overgrazing, and then producing enough fertility to support the scale of crop production that you want to do, both to feed those animals, but also to feed people.
Yeah, so you could have a biodynamic community, not just a biodynamic farm.
Okay. Exactly.
Yeah. But that's certainly something we're very used to at Heifer to do, is build community. But you say you do have, you're right, context matters, of course, quality of the soil, et cetera, rainfall, blah, blah. But it would be very important for us at Heifer to have a sense of the scale, the ranges that are needed, because we can help the farmers organize themselves that way. Not that we wouldn't necessarily call it biodynamic; it would be a closed loop, which I think is in this time of COVID, for example. Many of our farmers have suffered because of the lack of the supply system just collapsed. Right? Couldn't get feed, couldn't get seed. I mean, they couldn't get anything for a while in certain places.
What's interesting about that, it's both a kind of a resiliency approach, so
Right.
that you are more resilient in times when you can't access that supply chain, and you're also vulnerable when you're dependent on the cost of feed. And
Right.
but it also is, a much healthier farm ecosystem, because now you have a diversity of products. You're not reliant on one crop or one animal. And the fertility cycle, when animals graze land, they have an innate ability to kind of provide the nutrients that land needs.
Oh.
And so you actually create, not only do you need less inputs, but the inputs are more more harmonious with the land that you're on. And so there's just this regenerative cycle that happens, that your farm. And I think a big difference between biodynamic and conventional, and even to some extent organic, because organic often relies on continued inputs year after year,
Yeah.
organic inputs, but inputs. Whereas in a biodynamic farm, you need less and less inputs year over year, because you're building that soil bank, you're building that resilient kind of farm organism.
Yeah. So does your model also include the activity, such as this kind of management of livestock, where you move them? It's a regenerative system. You do that kind of work like Savory Institute does.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because, biodynamics aligns very well with permaculture principles and practices, and regenerative farming, holistic resource management.
Right.
And it's because of its spiritual nature, it's been less, I think, kind of assimilated by more mainstream, because it's a little out there. It's got the kind of anthroposophy and the kind of cosmic aspects. So, but it in its essence, it really is kind of, from what I've seen in the kind of different farming approaches, the most regenerative approach to agriculture.
Yeah. So part of selling this is, of course, successful selling of the produce that comes out of these farms, because you're not suggesting a commune kind of living where, or maybe you are, a commune type of living where the farmers sort of isolate themselves from society. I think it's the opposite, right? You want to integrate it so that the values that are embedded in your approach actually sort of seep or actually are presented to the community at large.
Yeah, I got interested in farming through biodynamics and community supported agriculture, CSA. So I actually think
Yeah.
it's kind of both. It's farming in the community context, but not to be isolated from society, but actually to be more integrated with society. How
All
do we
right.
bring farms to be more connected to the consumer? And that's where kind of the CSA. And interestingly, biodynamics has a strong social aspect. It's one of the differences with biodynamics and organic farming too, is it comes from Rudolf Steiner, and his work around the threefold kind of social order, and understanding that there's more to it than just um, the environmental, the ecological, and the social realms all come together in agriculture, right? That's what's
Yeah.
culture. And so, I've been very passionate both about farming in a way that's not having a negative impact on the environment, or human health, but rather having a really positive impact on the environment and human health. And at the same time, helping to be a tool for strengthening people's connection to the land, building more connected communities. And clearly farming has been pushed further and further away from cities and societies. And I think if we can bring it more in and make it more connected and integrated, it's more successful. So there's a lot to talk about that. I mean, I kind of evolved from being from a biodynamic farm, not wanting to specialize too much and become more of a market farmer. I wanted to preserve the integrity of the biodynamic principles and have a diversified farm ecosystem. And in order to do that, it's hard to scale, right? Because you're in
Mm-hmm.
this balance. So you're not trying to scale one product. You're really trying to, what you end up scaling is the community connection and relationships to the farm.
No, but I think also we talked about it briefly. The idea of having a biodynamic community or farming group or co-op or something that allows you to not scale the massive level that the industrial agriculture has, but at some higher level, which could work.
No, that's absolutely right. Because what happens is farmers are expected to do so many things, and in a
Yeah.
biodynamic doing everything, and it's kind of crazy, right? And it's farming, I think, inherently is more designed, or origins of being community based. So I think when you have more of a village and people are sharing in there, it's all connected, but some are doing, growing the feed, some are
Mm-hmm.
raising this animal and that animal, some are specializing in this crop and that crop and composting, and there's a community effort, and a collective. It makes it a lot more feasible, and a lot more fun.
Right. Yeah, it's more fun. So part of the way to sell product, like organic was sold on this, and is the content of the food itself, right? A lettuce grown hydroponically or in an industrial system in the Central Valley in California versus a biodynamic farm is fundamentally different, right? It looks approximately the same. So has work been done in terms of the nutritional quality and the content? Because I think at the end of the day, that's what we're going to have to convince consumers to say, you're going to be paying twice as much for this lettuce. Like we actually live in the same community, and the lettuce out of our organic farm here is delicious. Actually, they have much better flavor. But I don't know. I couldn't tell my wife what the nutritional content of this lettuce or tomato or pepper or whatever it is relative to what we
Yeah.
buy at Publix.
Well, it's funny, Pierre, I've got quite a bit of my own blood, sweat, and tears in that soil and that lettuce, having farmed there for many years, and that we're eating. And then also, my child, my oldest kid is turning 9 this month. He just started his own farm plot there at Serenity
Really?
Farms, and we
Yeah.
just got our soil test back, and we're composting and putting down organic fertilizer and growing food there. So, yeah, I mean, I think there has been some research done over the years comparing conventional, organic, and biodynamic produce. Um, One of my late mentors, Hugh Lovell, used to, when I ate the food on his biodynamic farm, as an example. I mean, one, you can really sense the difference. The wine industry picked up on that
Yeah.
first and foremost and
Yeah.
said, "Wow,
Yeah.
biodynamic wine has, the flavor profiles and the when you're paying attention to that level of detail like you do with wine, that's where biodynamics kind of, I think, got most of its recognition for being kind
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
highest quality. But when you break it down, it's pretty simple, right? It's like the soil health and the availability of nutrients and micronutrients and the amino acids that plants absorb in a healthy soil. And biodynamic soil is really the most living soil. When you treat the compost with the biodynamic preparations and you have this closed loop farming system, you really end up with superior quality produce at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I can't quote the specific research off the top of my head, but I know Walter Goldstein, where I first studied at the Michael Fields Institute 25 years ago, was doing studies back then and working with folks around the world on really understanding like shelf life, nutrient density, comparing biodynamics to organics and conventional, and finding that it is, um, it really does make a difference.
Yeah. No, interesting to talk about shelf life because the material, we occasionally, I'm sorry, we do that, buy some vegetables from Publix, and it doesn't last very long in our refrigerator. Whereas the stuff we get from the farm will last 2 weeks. It just stays alive. It's
Yeah,
really
I mean,
quite extraordinary.
I think you have a couple things going on there. One is really a great analogy actually that I learned, which is most food is grown with nutrients, chemical
Yeah.
nutrients, right? Fertilizer, liquid fertilizers, conventional or organic. And when you feed a plant through the water element, right? If you take like a radish that's grown hydroponically or, with heavy kind of liquid fertilizers, and you slice it really thin and you look through it, it's like translucent. And if you grow a radish in really dense, living, biodynamic, organic soil, and you slice it really thin and you try to look through it, it's solid. And so there's a different quality in the cell structure when it's fed through the watery element versus the life element, the soil, the nutrients, right? The minerals.
Yeah.
And so the water element doesn't store as well.
Right. Evaporates, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other, and it's not as nutrient dense. The other issue is when you're buying at the grocery store, it's already been on a truck probably.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's true. I forgot about that. That's right. And, it's interesting. As you know, we have a fairly substantial livestock operation now in Perryville, in Arkansas, and all of our animals are, regenerative, are grown in regenerative farm environment, and the density of the meat, the flavor of the meat, and the density of meat is noticeably different than the mass agriculture, the industrial kind of agriculture that we normally buy feed with.
Rudolf Steiner gave thousands of lectures, wrote so many books. And one of the things I remember sticking out for me, in addition to all the biodynamic work he did, is he wrote quite a bit on nutrition. And one of, and this is actually a good differentiator with biodynamics. Biodynamics is a little more of a spiritual science than just a pure science, right? Organics is more around chemistry and science. Biodynamics takes that and builds on it with a deeper understanding and viewpoint on how things happen in nature, and more of a biomimicry, biophilic kind of connection. And in nutrition, right, when you look at just the science of nutrition alone and the nutrients, right, and that you get from food, that's the physical part of the food. But there's a spiritual force in food. There's a life force in food. And what he talks about in his nutrition courses is that you actually absorb the sun energy. You're actually absorbing the life force of the food, and your body uses the minerals and stuff to kind of, you poop most of that out, right? You actually, the physical substance moves through you, and what you pull out of it is this life force. And so beyond nutrient density, which is obviously important, there's also this other level of like energetic life force that moves through moves through animals and plants, and that we're a part of that. We are not separate from it. We're a part of that process. And so where we draw our life force from and our energy from, and the way that food is grown is both energetic, it's spiritual, and it's physical, all at the same time.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned it a little bit before about the sort of the practices that are a bit different for biodynamic farming. Could you talk a little bit about that? The planting, the moon cycles, etc. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, so that's in the 3-minute version in the book, where I get into.
Well, we have time.
we get a little bit more into the. There's a couple of ways to explain it. Essentially, what I like to think of is like the Earth is this giant living organism, right? And there are these forces at play. And one of the easy ways to explain it, Steiner uses a compass. Actually, we don't question how a compass works. Right. There's these forces at play that we know when we have a compass tells us it's this way, right? South and north. And there are these polarities. And what happens is in agriculture, when you start to work with those forces, and this is what biodynamics is based on, is basically, enlivening the existing forces at play in nature to work for you on the farm. And so those forces at a basic level are a downward working force that happens when the dew settles, right, in the evening, when the sun is moving on the other side of the planet, because all life is kind of energy is drawing towards the sun.
Right.
Plants grow to the sun, right? And this energy is drawn to the sun. And so when the sun is on the other side of the earth from where we are, whether that's in the day or in the season, in the fall, the leaves fall, the earth breathes in. Right? Everything kind of goes downward in the earth, and there's decomposition and all this energy in the earth. In the evening, when the dew settles, that energy goes down. It's like the earth is breathing in. And in the morning, like in the spring, when the earth exhales, the energy is going up to the sun, right? So you have this upward working polarity and this downward working polarity. We kind of look at those as the cosmic force related to air and fire, which is silica. and the downward working force, which is this earthly force, which is lime and calcium. And the mediator between those is clay. And if you use the analogy of the human, which Steiner does, he says it's like a person standing on their head. Our head's like the soil, it's dense, mineral, rich, and that is like the soil. And he even says if you eat root crops is good for your brain, right?
Really?
And the diaphragm is like the skin, the soil, the layer, and then the atmosphere is like what's happening in circulation and respiration. And so he talks about kind of the head, the heart, and the guts, right? And the heart is like clay; it's the mediator between the head and the guts, the will, and the clay is the mediator between lime and silica.
Yeah.
And so you have these two polarities kind of
Right.
working against and together, and you make the biodynamic preparations. Two of the main preparations are horn silica, which you spray in the morning at sunrise in the spring to treat the atmosphere and help with photosynthesis of plants growing their fruits and their leaves. And in the evening and in the fall, as an example, you apply horn manure, and that treats the soil and feeds the biology.
Horn manure is basically regular livestock manure?
It's female cow manure buried in a cow horn in the fall.
In the fall.
To be buried and enlivened all winter. And the cow horn is this really cool focal device. And it's interesting, this is another way to illustrate this point, is the cow horn is from a point to a periphery. It goes in, the cow has all this inner energy, digestion, 4 stages of digestion, 9 stages of digestion, 4 stomachs, this complex,
Yeah. Well, enteric digestion is very incredible. Yeah.
Unbelievable. And the manures, as a result, so valuable. And so cows have an inner working energy, and that's why we use the cow horn. It's a focal device that's channeling that energy in. Deer, opposite, go from a point to a periphery, right?
Yeah.
And they're very hypersensitive to the external world.
Yeah.
Their poops are really tight and small and hard.
Right.
Okay, so these are the kinds of things that Steiner's looking at basic forms and forces, formative forces in nature to help us better understand how to work with these animals and these plants. And so most of the preparations are plants and animals, either animal manures or minerals like silica, quartz crystals. Stinging nettles are a big one, very high in silica. Dandelions, very high in calcium. Chamomile, yarrow, right? So he's taking these wild herbs, essentially, looking at their patterns of growth. He studied Goethe a lot and the metamorphosis of plants, and really just started to understand some of these basic, kind of what native, more indigenous communities have this generational wisdom of understanding plants and working with plants. So basically, it's very interesting. I mean, he basically came up with these kind of bizarre formulas where you take these specific herbs, you put them in an animal organ, let them decompose at certain times of the year, potentize those herbs, and infuse them with both the energetic pattern of that organ, and the actual living microbiome of those things, and then put that in our compost and inoculate our farms. And this is all homeopathic. These are small amounts of very potent materials. So it's not this truckloads of manures. We're talking about potentizing these things so that they're more homeopathic, effective homeopathically at enlivening these forces, not just the physical substance of things, but the natural forces at play.
The catalytic, right? It's essentially,
Exactly. And then you're just you're just charging up the natural rhythms and forces in nature. We just are orchestrators. That's what we can do. We can just work with nature.
Yeah. Wow. So when, it sounds really interesting. It also sounds like a lot of work. So would you say it's a lot of work relative to an organic farmer, or?
The irony is it takes a bit of effort for sure, but the return on that investment of effort is so powerful. A little tiny handful of material treats an acre.
Okay.
So when you start thinking at scale, this is not just a small scale thing. I mean, this was, People
right.
like Podolinsky and Pfeiffer spread biodynamics over millions of acres around Australia, New Zealand, and India. Because it is so, it's all the tools are there. There's no technology.
Right.
The nettles grow, the chamomile grows, the manure's there. You're just reusing the otherwise organs that you throw away. So you're just using everything that's around you. You're harnessing it in a way where it can become potentized and applied in a way that's going to be really effective. So actually, for the return of effort is actually really good. Relatively speaking, you're talking about low cost, very low cost inputs per acre compared to most types of farming. But you kind of have to like get into the
no, it's a mind thing,
mindset.
for sure, mindset. So in terms of actual practice of biodynamic farming, is it mostly in California as usual, or where's the practice actually being
it's bigger
pursued?
in Europe. It's been taken off a lot more in Europe.
Oh, really?
In Australia and places like India. There are some pretty strong biodynamic movements around the world where it's been around and kind of caught on more. In the U.S., you have the National Biodynamic Conference. The Biodynamic Association puts on every 2 years. It's been going on for, I don't know, 30 years or so now. I've been to about a dozen of them. Fabulous annual conference. And then there's local conferences and local chapters of biodynamic groups around the country. There's a strong one in Northern California, not as strong in Southern California where I was recently. We had a small group. The Midwest, because biodynamics actually came to the U.S. through the Midwest. So where I actually was fortunate to study under Ruth Zinnecker, who the Zinnecker family, close to the Michael Fields Institute, was really the epicenter of biodynamics in this country. Her family brought it from Europe to Wisconsin. So there's a good, strong biodynamic community in the Midwest. And in the Northeast and in the Southeast, Hugh Lovell, where I studied under Hugh, and Jeff Poppin, the barefoot farmer in Tennessee.
Yeah, sure.
He's had a ton of interns over the last 30 years that have gone off and practiced biodynamics. It's become pretty big in Colorado. There's a group down there doing great work. So, it's sprinkled out across the country. But it hasn't grown. I mean, you see the growth of regenerative agriculture movement, right? Just in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, having been at this for 25 years and being kind of, so connected in the biodynamic community. It didn't catch on as much because I think it's harder to grasp. It's too esoteric for the mainstream.
Yeah, there is an esoteric element to it. I'm a little bit familiar with Rudolf Steiner's work through the Waldorf school system, which is the man was a genius, right? It really was. And,
I mean, there's not many people that have, you can say, point to biodynamic agriculture, Waldorf education, anthroposophical medicine, the Camp Hill communities. I mean, he's got quite a legacy. I mean, he's also got some, he was of a time too, where there's some criticisms of him, like all, there's always, nobody's perfect, right? He's got some issues, but he did some amazing work. I mean, people considered him a bit of a clairvoyant, right? He was able to, and I'll say it's interesting because when I got into biodynamics and I said to the then director of the Biodynamic Association, 94, and I said, how do I get the lectures? I want to read, he gave 8 lectures in 1924 to Polish farmers that became the foundation for biodynamic agriculture. And he said, before you read these lectures, you need to read 3 other books so you can understand these lectures. And they were how to know higher worlds, theosophy, and occult science, which have very little or anything to do with agriculture, but everything to do with being human and understanding the universe in a different way. And some of it's about meditation and how meditation works and how you tap into kind of universal knowledge. And he did that on a level like the prolific, right, on so many topics.
Yeah.
So there's some esoteric kind of digging into kind of digging deeper into a spiritual realm where you can kind of begin to learn how to be human in a way that we just haven't been taught.
At Heifer, we're very much, at Heifer, we're very much in line with that because one of our slogans is the future is farmers. It's just the idea that land, soil health, quality, regenerative farming, biodynamic is basically the source of prosperity and happiness, actually, for the world. So, well, on that note, we have to end. We could have gone on for another hour, I think. I got so many other questions, but you're just nearby. I'm gonna invite you to lunch soon, and we can have another conversation, longer conversation about this. This is fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
I love that we're neighbors, and
yeah.
And I really appreciate all the work that you all do over there at Heifer, and excited to learn more and dig in deeper.
Well, we'll get you over to the ranch, and we can kick some dirt together, which I love to do. So, all right, Daron. Thanks a lot, Farmer D. Appreciate it always. Take care. Ciao, ciao.